So, this is a video that I've been planning to do for a very long time, but I keep putting off because it has been so much work and I haven't even started editing it yet. I'm doing a genre breakdown. This is something that's been requested a lot of me because there are a lot of genres and sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. So I've done a lot of research. This is just information that I've found online, and because there are so many genres and subgenres, I am not going to exhaust it. So there will be some subgenres and genres that I'm not going to exclusively mention, pretty much just sticking to the most popular genres and their most popular subgenres, so it's not an exhaustive list. And if there's any genres that you'd like to clarify or expand on that I didn't give a full exhaustive information on, feel free to chat with me more about it in the comments. I did my best, y'all. So we're gonna start with the big one, and that is fantasy. First, I'm just gonna get out of the way high fantasy and low fantasy, which I don't consider subgenres. I more consider them clarifiers, but it was listed under subgenres under most of the websites that I used as reference. So we'll talk about them real fast. Fantasy is a genre that typically features magic in some way with the plot, setting, or theme. It may also include mythical creatures. High fantasy is an entirely fictional world, where low fantasy is the real world or very similar, just happens to have magical elements. If you're interested in more clarifications about fantasy and things like that, like soft magic system, hard magic systems, etc., I have a bunch of terms that we often use here on BookTube, book blogging, just genres and terms used a lot. I'll link that video up there as well as in the description. Next is grimdark fantasy. Grimdark is actually a subgenre that was created based off of a quote. In the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. Grimdark is exactly what you would think. It is especially bloody and violent and very dark. It's also a subgenre that doesn't have extreme clarifiers. Everything's pretty vague, just grimdark is grim and dark. So a lot of times people will argue about if a book is grimdark or not. A lot of people argue about Game of Thrones being grimdark. Everybody has their own threshold of what is grimdark and what qualifies, and because there's no exact qualifier, it's just something that's up for discussion. Kind of the same for epic fantasy. This is one that a lot of people have requested I clarify, and the thing with epic fantasy is that it's kind of used exchangeably with high fantasy. It's set in another world. Epic fantasy is just more epic in scope. So some people use epic fantasy and high fantasy the same with this in the same way and think that it's the same thing. Some people think that epic fantasy is one step higher above high fantasy. And again, because it's all subjective, nobody really knows. Next, we have urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is when there are supernatural or paranormal creatures, people hidden within a city, and the protagonist is protecting that city. Paranormal is mostly just focused around paranormal creatures. Vampires, werewolves, demons, etc. A lot of times urban fantasy and paranormal are kind of a crossover. There's a lot of crossovers as well. Next genre I'm going to be discussing is sci-fi, and the sci-fi genre is considered the literature of ideas. Sci-fi typically deals with imaginative and futuristic concepts such as advanced science and technology, time travel, parallel universes, space exploration, and extraterrestrial life. Sci-fi has a ton of subgenres. A lot of them are really obvious, like alien invasion or time travel. I'm gonna skip those. First, I'm going to talk about space opera. Space opera is a subgenre of science fiction that emphasizes space warfare, melodramatic adventure, interplanetary battles, and risk-taking. A more rude definition I found is a novel, movie, or television program set in outer space, typically of a simplistic and melodramatic manner. Rude. Next is steampunk. Steampunk is a work set in an era where steam power is still widely known, but with technological inventions, often with alternate history elements. And the last subgenre that I'll mention is sci fantasy. This is scientifically advanced technology merged with fantastical elements. It's a crossover genre. There are a lot of crossover genres. There are a lot of books that are two different genres. Romance! For romance, the primary focus is on a relationship and romantic love between people. For subgenres, we have contemporary romance, which means that it is local, in our time, in our location or something very similar to it. We have historical, which is a recognizable era or setting prior to World War II, and there's an attention to detail in what's unusual to us, such as objects in home, transportation, and social mores. A Regency romance set during a period of the British Regency or early 19th century, rather than simply being versions of contemporary romance stories transported to a historical setting. I don't really know the difference between a Regency romance and a historical romance other than what I just read. I guess it's just more specific. But it seems like Regency is a subgenre of historical, which is a subgenre of romance. Erotic. So erotica is basically a romance with a strong emphasis on detailed sex. Some romances focus primarily on relationship and a little bit of sex or no sex, and erotica is a lot of sex, maybe with a little bit of romance. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Probably don't know what I'm talking about. Inspirational, from what I understand, is basically the opposite of erotica, where it's all romance, no sex. Mystery, a genre that is primarily focused on a mysterious death or crime that needs to be solved. We have cozy mysteries, which is a style that features minimal violence, sex, and social relevance. A solution is usually achieved by intellect or intuition rather than police procedure figuring it out. Classic detective. It generally features a mysterious death, a closed circle of suspects who all have motives and reasonable opportunity to commit the crime, and the protagonist is the detective who has to find out who done it. Next genre is thrillers. The purpose of a thriller is suspense, thrilling, making you have a heightened sense of anxiety and nervousness about what's to come next. Subgenres, we have crime thriller, which is essentially a crossover, I think, as far as I understand, of mystery and thriller. Whodunit, detective. A psychological thriller means, in addition to the traits of a regular thriller, a psychological thriller incorporates elements of a drama and mystery. In a psychological thriller, the suspense of the subgenre comes from the mind. The protagonist in a psychological thriller must rely on their mental resources to solve the situation. The purpose of a psychological thriller, as I understand it, is to mess with your mind. Either the character is nutso and an unreliable narrator, or someone else is nutso and making them believe that they're an unreliable narrator. But all the twists and everything that happens is supposed to mess with your head. The next genre is horror, and its purpose is to scare ya. A gothic horror tells tales of mysteries, forbidden love, ruined castles, moral decay, fallen ancestries, madmen, and various sorts of spirits. As far as I understand it, it's kind of like a historical horror, maybe, set in a specific time. Body horror is a subgenre that intentionally showcases graphic or psychologically disturbing violations of the human body. These violations may manifest through sex, mutilations, mutation, zombification, gratuitous violence, disease, or unnatural movements of the body. Sounds fun. Dystopian is technically, I think, a subgenre from science fiction, but it wasn't listed as a subgenre in the websites that I was looking at, and it's not oftentimes used as a subgenre for science fiction. Pretty much dystopian is used as a genre of its own, which is why I decided to categorize it that way in this video. But I believe it is a subgenre of science fiction, technically. Dystopians put a focus on political structure, specifically political structures that have gone very dark and very corrupt. It's usually set in the future, but it can definitely be set in the past as well. And it's sort of like an alternate timeline that focuses on what if the government was corrupt and the world went in this direction instead. And the only subgenre I'm going to talk about for this is post-apocalyptic. So post-apocalyptic is a subgenre that showed up in pretty much every genre I looked up. It showed up for sci-fi, fantasy, horror. Post-apocalyptic is a common one. And for a novel to be post-apocalyptic, the setting must be one where the end of the world has already taken place and the characters are trying to survive and start anew. A lot of times it involves things like zombies, but it certainly doesn't have to. And the last one I'm going to talk about is literary fiction, which is considered serious fiction. Literary fiction are books that are considered to have more literary merit than your average everyday book. At least that's what the definitions I found said, which just sounds so snooty. So as far as I can understand it, taking away the pretentious language, it seems like literary fiction is just supposed to mean a book that stands the test of time, a book that really is saying something profound and meaningful that's going to stick with you, that'll be valuable for a long time. There are so many genres that I missed. You have suspense, which again is very similar to thriller. You have adventure novels, drama novels. There are so many genres out there, and there are so many subgenres for every genre that this video could be an hour long, and I still may not get to it all. So I'm cutting it off there. I made the decision to only talk about the most commonly talked about books, or at least commonly talked about that I hear. I made the decision to focus on fiction specifically because nonfiction is a lot more self-explanatory. And I made the decision to also cut off how many subgenres I talk about in each one. If there's any that I missed that I didn't get to talk about, Google is your friend, but also we can definitely talk about it in the comments. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.